Israel is facing increasing international pressure, even from its staunch allies, to de-escalate its operations in Gaza, from the ICJ's provisional measures to the US, at least in principle, opposing a planned invasion of Rafah. Yet IDF atrocities committed against people in Gaza continue to be broadcast onto our social media feeds. Last week, Israeli troops raided Nasser Hospital, which had been the largest functioning hospital in Gaza. Doctors and other medical staff were forced to leave the hospital stripped down to their underwear and wait in freezing conditions for hours. Several patients were reported dead after Israel cut off the hospital's electricity. This video from Al Jazeera shows what a team of UN doctors found upon entering the hospital after being denied access by Israel for several days.
This is the former emergency department of National Medical Complex. And it's a death zone.
This place used to reconstruct limbs of patients that otherwise would be amputated. Now this place is no longer operational.
We were shocked what we actually saw in National Medical Complex. There's waste everywhere. Electricity was not working. Parts of the hospital are damaged and some severely damaged.
We're in the process of moving the last patient remaining. She was successfully extubated and she will continue her treatment in the surgical ward in the old building.
Now all medical team who remained at Nasser Hospital already arrested. We don't have so much news from Nasser Hospital because Nasser Hospital became like a military base for IDF.
What is the humanity? Why this is happening to us? Why? I don't know. I don't know. For how long this will continue? For how long? I don't know how many of us have to die. How many of us have to die just to listen to us, to stop these crimes?
I don't know how much more footage of grown men being reduced to tears as they talk about trying to preserve life in this sort of death campaign. I literally don't know how much more my heart can take. Al Jazeera also released this footage. It shows hungry children scooping up flour dropped by an aid truck and demonstrates the severity of the starvation crisis being imposed on Gazans by Israel's blockade of aid. Israel's blockade of Gaza has prevented adequate aid from entering the Strip. And when an aid truck does manage to get in, chaos understandably breaks out as people scramble to find food. And instead of allowing more aid to enter the region, Israel simply opens fire on people trying to feed themselves and their families. The particular instance that you saw in that clip where a bag of flour burst, at least one person was shot by the IDF and several admitted to hospital in their attempt to get hold of basic resources. So what we have here is the highest international court in the world, the most powerful legal instrument we have. It warned Israel that it must do everything in its power to prevent genocide. That included reining in its military operations, ensuring the provision of humanitarian aid, and submitting a report showing that it is doing everything it can to protect civilians. And yet, the world is literally watching the IDF switch off the electrical power that's keeping patients alive in hospitals and attacking people trying to get access to the tiny amounts of international aid that it's being allowed to access the region. Israel seems to be on a mission to castrate even the mere remaining illusion that international accountability mechanisms exist. In fact, the only solid evidence that we have that Israel is heeding calls to prevent genocide is a communique issued by IDF Chief of Staff Herzi Halevi to his commanders. In it, Halevi states, "We are not on a killing, revenge, or genocide campaign." And he asks commanders to, quote, "not shoot revenge videos." So, on the one hand, we have mountains of footage and evidence from international human rights organizations and from Palestinians themselves, meticulously documenting how an entire population is being starved and indiscriminately killed. And on the other hand, a note, basically saying, be nice. And if you aren't being nice, then at least don't film it. Michael, how do you think on a kind of everyday level, people's illusions about things like human rights and the integrity of human rights. How do you think that illusion is kind of being cracked on the net on a kind of everyday basis, particularly in Britain and the US? And do you think that's going to have an impact? Like, what do you think is the consequence of this kind of, like I said, like kind of castrating of the idea that there is an international accountability mechanism when such a huge scale violation of human rights is taking place?
Probably just overriding cynicism, right? And I mean, it's very interesting that this war is taking place at the same time as Russia's war on Ukraine. I mean, both of these wars, essentially, I think, illegal colonial wars, right? Putin, yes, he had some complaints about NATO, but the guy invaded Ukraine, and then, doesn't seem to have acted in. I mean, it's almost nonsense to talk about sort of the Geneva Conventions when he invaded. It's a war of aggression against a neighboring state, right? With the intention to annex part of it. So incredibly illegal. Couldn't really be more illegal internationally. Israel, they've occupied Gaza, depending on your definition, for 76 or 57 or 56 years. According to everyone agrees they've been occupying the occupied territories for 56 years, right? So you can't really get more illegal than that. And now they are collectively punishing 2 million people. So you've got two cases that should really be quite similar in our minds when it comes to the morality of them. And I think, what people have seen is that our political establishment, our media, massively mobilized when it came to Russia's invasion of Ukraine to say, this is unacceptable. This is not what we should see in the 21st century. We have to unite and take really strong actions to force Russia to change its tune. That's going to include sanctions. It's going to include, Russia getting kicked out of the Eurovision Song Contest and sort of all sorts of things where it's sort of saying we need to draw a massive red line under this. When it comes to Israel and Gaza, we might ask them a little bit nicely to be nicer, but we're still going to send them arms. The idea that Israel should be kicked out of any kind of competition is itself anti-Semitic. I think it just gives an enormous sense of cynicism and double standards. And it will make it very difficult for Western countries. And I do think there are, I'm not of the mind that the sort of move to defend Ukraine is purely cynical. I think it is useful to sort of be able to mobilize to some degree global opinion to say that invading a neighbor is unacceptable. But how the hell? And I mean, this obviously isn't news to countries in the global south. I think this is probably waking up populations in the global north more than it is sort of a revelation to countries in the global south, because they are full or very much aware that when it comes to sort of the pretensions to be a moral force in the world, the West is very much inconsistent. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Really depends on the interests of the country at hand. So I don't think the double standards will be a surprise to many publics in the global south, but it is a wake-up call to publics in the global north, that sort of the claim of Western governments to be moral arbiters of what is right and wrong in the world is very much contingent on the interests of whichever government is in power in those Western countries. And actually, to be honest, that makes it sound like it's more democratically decided than it is, because whoever was in power in the United States, they would pretty much have the same policy with regard to this genocidal war by Israel on the Palestinians in Gaza.
Anecdotally, I would completely say that that's true. I remember when Russia invaded Ukraine, the kind of household conversations that were at least happening in a lot of Middle Eastern households, from what I know, was this kind of sense of, and obviously this was before this latest assault on Gaza, but there was a lot of anger not because of any particular investment in taking a particular side in that war, but rather this sense of, so the international community is mobilizing and condemning Russia for breaking international law, which, look, if we have international law, the only way that it's meaningful is if there is, mechanisms of accountability that can be immediately mobilized. But all that they could think about was, but what about Iraq? Iraq was an illegal war, and it went ahead and it claimed the lives of 1 million people. And there was a deep frustration and anger that the same nations that illegally invaded Iraq were now getting on their high horse about the illegal invasion of Ukraine, when really, as you said, it shouldn't be that complicated. It should simply be, if we have international law and if we have things that, at least if we have at least the semblance of the idea that one country invading another, and particularly an imperial power invading another country, should be condemned, it has to be across the board. Otherwise, it's just politics rather than any kind of actual reliable or form of accountability that has integrity. And it's that kind of crisis of legitimacy in the eyes of people, in the global north, that I think that's what the shift has probably been. But we'll have to wait and see. That's an ideological shift that I guess will take quite a long time to see the impacts of it unfold.